Hello?
Yeah, we heard in there as well as in here.
I think this. Okay, whoops. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out. This is an excellent start to 2018. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jason Young. I'm the director of the School of Architecture, and it's my pleasure to announce tonight's speaker. So, Bureau Spectacular imagines other worlds and engages the design of architecture through telling stories. Beautiful stories about character development, relationships, curiosities, and attitudes. Absurd stories about fake realities that invite enticing possibilities. The stories conflate design, representation, theory, criticism, history, and taste into cartoon pages. These cartoon narratives swerve into the physical world through architectural installations, models, and small buildings. That's a statement from an older statement from the Bureau Spectacular website. There's another new nifty one on there now, but that one I think is important really for the backdrop of the work that Jimenez Lai is going to share with us tonight and really pull the trajectory from early thinking that he's done to more recent projects. So Jimenez started Bureau Spectacular in 2008 and has rapidly assembled an amazing track record of accomplishments. In 2012, he won the Architectural League Prize for Young Architects, New York Architectural League Prize. He won the debut award at the Lisbon Triennale in 2013. He was the curator and designer for the 2014 Taiwan Pavilion at the 14th Venice Architectural Biennale. And in 2015, Jimenez organized the Treatise exhibition and publication series at the Graham Foundation. In 2017, he and his studio exhibited a large-scale installation at SF MoMA based on the drawing Inside, Outside, Between, Beyond, which is a 2014 drawing that was acquired by the SF MoMA in 2015. And I was telling Jimenez earlier, I was in San Francisco shortly after Craig Dykers was here, and I went to the SF MoMA to kind of check out, fact check what he shared with us, which he did good. And I stumbled across this exhibit of Bureau Spectacular, and there were 5 or 6 people in maybe a 20 by 20 space that this thing was in. And I told the person I was with, I want to check that out because we were headed to something else. And then we came back by to check it out. There was another 7, 8 people, different people there. Then about 45 minutes later, we left the building and passed by again, and another 6, 7, 8 people there. It was a constant flow of people looking at just this stunning installation and models and drawings. He'll show the project in his talk. And what was super impressive to me is that the message to the project was really one of how creativity and imagination and young people, were really the keys. So it was a really important message to the work, really stunning, beautiful work, and in a great venue. And so I took a photo and I texted it to Jimenez and just said, congratulations, I think this is great for you guys and obviously great for architecture and design, that you have such a public engagement with work that on the surface you wouldn't imagine as sort of constructed around public engagement. So there are many other things going on in the work. More recently, just last week, what I think will be a seminal exhibition opened at the GSD, curated by K. Michael Hayes and Andrew Holder, called Inscriptions, Architecture Before Speech. And that exhibit, which is really cross-cutting across a new and exciting kind of generation of architects, includes the work from Bureau Spectacular, among many. Jimenez is also widely published, and has really a global presence. The MoMA collected the White Elephant project, which he'll show just on a quick, that's an early super furniture project in MoMA's collection, in SF MoMA collection. Citizens of No Place, which I know a lot of you in the audience know this book, published by Princeton Architectural Press with a grant from the Graham Foundation in 2012. And this is really cool. This draft 2 of that book has been archived at the new museum as part of the show Younger Than Jesus, which is, anyway, I thought that was cool. Good name for a show. So Jimenez was born in Taiwan. He received his education at University of Toronto. He's currently on the faculty at UCLA. He held the Lafave Fellowship at The Ohio State University. He held the Howarth Wright Fellowship at Taliesin West. He also taught at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He's teaching currently at Columbia as well as, or that was last semester, at Columbia as well as UCLA. He spent time in this part of the world. He was also on the faculty at Kentucky. So his work is unique, it's contemporary, it's urgent, playful, daring, experimental, and representationally alive. Great combo. And in my opinion, he has just the type of beginner's mind that we should all strive for, whether we're beginners or not. So really, really happy that he's here. Help me welcome Jimenez Lai.
Hi. Jason, what a warm welcome, and thank all of you for being here. I really appreciate it. No matter how many times you do stuff like this, one always gets a bit nervous, so bear with me. So today, I will power through a very long presentation, but I will condense it as much as I can. And it would be roughly 5.5, let's say, chapters of sorts. You know, at the beginning, I'm going to introduce the practice Bureau Spectacular, and then I'll talk about these 5 subchapters: posture, materiality, fitness, metamodernism, and afterlife. So these are the 5 basic points. And because of the nature of this presentation being so overwhelmingly thick, I will first say that I'm going to gauge the room. If the room feels a bit tired, which it might be, I'm just going to click through the slides and not present them. So Bureau Spectacular began in 2008, sort of. And I would say, I mean, I can explain the symbols. Maybe that's a story for another time, because you know, by April of 2018, we're going to get a whole new look. We're possibly not going to rely on these symbols. What I'll say though is that that's this chess symbol for queen. It's a reminder that as a pawn piece, you can only go one step at a time. You die easily, but if you're lucky and you persist, you might reach the other end of the board, and at that point you can swap yourself out for something else. The symbol on the right is the other reminder, which is a different game, the playing card. It's a reminder that even when times are hard and one becomes jaded and angry and everything, don't forget to be nice to people. So these are the 2 reminders. And you know, Bureau Spectacular, we were working off of the history of acronyms in architecture practices, and we thought this was a great acronym. It is now not just myself, it's myself and Joanna Grant. We're working together. We were just here, but since moved out, we've been priced out of Skid Row, which is so sad. But it was a super nice space for a while, for about 80 cents a square foot, which is unheard of in Los Angeles, but we got priced out. But for about a good 8 years or so, we were doing stuff like this, installations where we built rooms that rotate once an hour so that your relationship with the ground changes every 15 minutes. Every 15 minutes, the notion of plan, section, reflected ceiling plan changes for every cycle. So we really want to ask about the status of cylinders and how that generates different drawings. To resist gravity, between cylinders and spheres, this is the aforementioned White Elephant project. What if you flip around something that is not a cylinder but a sphere? What does that do to the outside of architecture rather than the inside? If this is a story about the interiority of architecture as a cylinder, this is a abstracted low resolution sphere that gets tumbled around and attains different characters, which I'll also mention a bit more. You know, I've also drawn a lot of comics over the last 10 years or so, and being, let's say, being attracted to the nature of something like comics, of course, zines and publications were also very important to me. I've always been a big fan of pamphlet architecture, and at one point had the opportunity to organize something like it. And today, I would say 2015 marked a new chapter of Bureau Spectacular. I would say in some ways, Bureau Spectacular is about 2 years old as a professional practice. We spent a good 8 years thinking about the example set by Toyo Ito, which, you know, he spent a good 8 years doing something like the Urban Robots project. And we did, for sure, waste our time and waste our youth in order to learn something about how to better articulate ourselves before getting into professional practice. And so today we are actually getting clients who want this kind of nonsense. Which is great because we're even getting some of them built, and I'll talk a little more about that through the 5 subchapters. I'll say that there were probably 3 basic stages in the first 8 to 10 years of our practice. Stage 1 is cartoons about architecture, in that cartoon is the medium, architecture is the subject matter. And stage 2, I would say cartoonish architecture, where architecture is the medium and cartoon is the sensibility. And, you know, this could take the form of plans or sections. And today I think we're thinking more about cartoons on architecture. If the lifetimes of individuals who play out their days live inside of architecture, and these lifetimes can be considered story arcs, I would consider that cartoons inside of architecture. And hopefully, as we do more cartoons inside of architecture, we can even expand such definitions to life being inscribed onto architecture. At times, the bubbles are very literal with individuals inside of them, biblical characters and so, and others are the times the bubbles are just very abstract. They're just cartoonish bubbles. So these are the things that we're working on now, and so that's a very brief summary of who we are, Bureau Spectacular. So we're going to get to first of the 5 subchapters, posture. So the Tower of Told Stories is something that we built in 2016 at the Coachella Music Festival. And this project is going to come up several times throughout the talk. And this is a 52 feet by 28 by 25 feet structure, the tallest thing that we've done thus far. And, you know, related to this project, I think, you know, we've been wanting to think about architecture as character. Can architecture display signs of personality? Are they a skyline of individuals standing around having a conversation? These are the things that we're thinking about. In 2017, we were invited to be a part of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, where curators Mark Lee and Sharon Johnston asked us to be in a room called Horizontal City, where we have to look at a photograph, choose a historic photograph of a canonical work of architecture and produce a response in the format of a model. And we chose the interior of Adolf Loos's Mueller House, realized in Prague in 1930. The 2 reasons that we chose this project is number 1, voyeurism, and number 2, the principle of cladding. So that's where we were. We took this opportunity to consider the status of architecture as a machine for voyeurism. We wanted to find a way to further elaborate upon our reading of Beatrice Colomina's reading of Loos's work and spend time on furthering this architectural diagram. To say that an architecture could be a machine for voyeurism is to also say that there is a spectator-spectacle relationship between multiple players that live inside a continuous interior. If we consider architecture as a stage that builds characters, there are the players that play their parts, and there will be the viewers who become the audiences. The Great Hall, where something like a living room looks back at the other 4 characters inside the Mueller house, a kitchen, an entryway, a corridor, a children's room, and a lady's boudoir, meaning the gaze of the living room is in control of the other four characters, the kitchen or a servant, the entryway or corridor, or a stranger, the children, and the ladies. This is a story about the construction of power within an architecture. The voyeur is not only an audience, but a person in control over the other four characters in a house through the act of seeing. So this is our reading of the Raumplan. In 2013, I wrote a story titled Sociopaths. It is a short graphic novel about a murder case. 3 witnesses, all suspects. The wife in this murder mystery tells a story about jealousy, lust, and revenge. She describes a silent dinner party, an attempted love affair, the act of spying, and a physical altercation between the 2 men who grew jealous of each other. In this story, she takes a bust sculpted in the likeness of the eventual murder victim and drops it on his head from a mezzanine. As he nears his final seconds of his life, his gaze haunts her. She could not tell whether his final glance was at her or at himself. Because we also saw the flip side of voyeurism as being narcissism. In our model, we installed one-way mirrors for the 4 characters who are being watched from the living room. The one-way mirrors prevents the awareness of the spectacle from gaining the awareness that they're being watched or spied on. We installed buttons on either ends of the podium that the model sits on. From the living room side, the act of turning on or off the internal lighting meant whether or not the other 4 portals are revealed. So the second reason why we chose Loos' Muller House is the principle of cladding, an essay written by Adolf Loos. We chose it because the carpet or an animal hide as a livable material is something that once we covered ourselves, that became the first architectural detail. So this idea was something that I worked on in 2011 in this story, Primitives. Through the story, I was able to work through ideas about skinning, quilting, cladding, all acts about covering oneself under animal hide. The reduction of the detail meant the making of a mystery. An absence of a human face meant a self unable to convey one's exact thinking, relying only on abstract body language. So the idea of the covered face where the abstract body communicating something is maybe as old as how we have always studied the human figure in the history of art. So from the Greek kouros on your far left, which has a bilaterally symmetrical stiffness to it, or the middle, the famous Michelangelo's David, who is performing contrapposto, communicating a sense of relaxation and confidence, or Bernini's David here in the mid-motion of a torque, communicating an intensity to his personality. And so this is something that, I've always found very important. If one were to ask me, why is it that I think postures are important? Because if we consider every skyline that represents a society to be a sentence, if architecture is language that communicates such sentences, the individual characters that architects contribute to offered an insight to the psyche of that society. Because these 2-dimensional graphics are so powerful and so meaningful to people who have such skylines. At times, they're proud enough to print it on their t-shirts and their mugs, almost as a symbol or a flag of sorts. So to reiterate this point, I think if we can regard architecture as characters, at times, if we're saying it's not what you're saying, but how you're saying it, and if the content of the message is synonymous every time, I'm just saying city, city, city repeatedly, but then it is how the city is said each time. Let's say whether it's comprised of a series of italicized characters or upright characters that communicates the general spirit of that city. So this is really why we elaborated on the concept of character so much. And the SF MoMA project, including the White Elephant project, were all ideas about character making. So I'm going to skip these. I showed Jason the 5 o'clock shadow, which is really nice, because Loos really didn't like ornaments. So this kind of abominable snow creature for us was a way of thinking about a shrink-wrapped character. We even found this rubber material that most resemble human flesh, and gave the architecture lips so that it can kiss back. It's really disgusting. Okay, so that was point one, posture, and you know, this might come back somehow. Just the idea is that architecture has character, and architecture makes characters. So the second is materiality. What's interesting is that, you know, from the beginning, I think Jason and I had conversations about color, or the status of colors. The work that we used to do in the office at one point was incredibly colorful, especially for the Venice Biennale. You know, Takeshi Murakami was always in the back of our minds, and we were always thinking about rainbows and unicorns. But something happened to us once we moved to Los Angeles, and I want to explain what that is. And that has happened maybe now for the 3.5 years that we've been in Los Angeles. And that is, this happened to us. The first thing that I happened upon when I went to Los Angeles was this artwork from Vincent Lamarot. This is the Bates Hotel project in Los Angeles on Sunset Boulevard, where Vincent Lamarot painted the entirety of the Bates Hotel white. This said a few things to me. It says to me that stucco is white, concrete is white, steel is white, wood is white, even nature is white. And it made me think a bit harder about the rest of Los Angeles and the Angelenos, or people who have been through Los Angeles. It made me think a little bit harder about their engagement with the idea of white. So from Andrew Kovac's first office, Aaron Bessler, Ante Liu, Malton, Johnston Markley, and even in the less likely scenarios, somehow they had a white moment. This is Greg Lynn. Or even in the least likely scenarios, Hernan Diaz-Alonso has somewhat of a white moment. So it made me think a lot about the status of white and what is white. And so the context of white, the color in Los Angeles, somehow had some, I mean, you know, I'm just then beginning to think about the etymology of what white is. Is it blankness? Is it a sense of, you know, nakedness, where nudity, where honesty, where nature, where natural, where neutral even? So I started thinking along these lines and what that means for other cultures around the world. So in Japan, for instance, maybe it's the residue of wood, or the visibility of wood, that communicated such sense of honesty or authenticity or neutrality of sorts. And maybe for places like Northern Europe, it has to be brick, no matter what. And even in the cases where, you know, the materiality itself transcends beyond brick, it still has to take the form and shape of brick for some reason. Or in the context of the United States. So I turned to this image, which is one of my favorite images to think about. I wish I had a higher resolution. I might have to go take some pictures. But this is the river bank of LA River, a favorite playground once upon a time for graffiti artists to claim their territories. And so when we think about the history and tradition of rock art, where early humans would go and announce their presence, a declaration of boundaries of sorts, are now being censored by a political entity called Los Angeles. So if, let's say, whatever local gangs are declaring themselves with whichever color and shapes and forms, for Los Angeles, the entity, the political entity, the declaration is white. So this act of mass censorship declares, number one, the stance on Los Angeles as a political project, and number two, Los Angeles' view on what white is. Because here, the act of erasure declares to me that Los Angeles thinks that white is as good as concrete. Meaning, white in Los Angeles, finally, is not a color in Los Angeles. White is a material. So it made me think more about other artists who work on the status of white. You know, is erasure itself white, or a kind of censorship or silencing a kind of white? Do we go from as concrete as Ando or as silence as John Cage, I don't really know, but this is one of the conclusions about color and materiality that I'm working through at the moment. And maybe knowingly or unknowingly, a bunch of our work has been white. So the Tower of 12 Stories, the aforementioned installation project at Coachella Music Festival, is white. But clearly it's not, it wasn't always white. I've always, so when this project came out, I had to face the press a few times, and they would ask, what's this project made of? My earnest and straightforward answer would be lumber and steel, but my snarky answer would be white. It's made of white. But we had this moment where, this was the final visit before everything was, let's say pulled up and painted over. I thought, during this visit, I really thought to myself, man, this is so beautiful. Why do we have to paint it white? Why don't we just leave it? Because our work wasn't always white. The Briefcase House, for example, a house that I lived in back in Chicago, a house that, I built back in, this would have been 2010 or 2011 or so. That was freshly after the financial crisis, and rent was super cheap. This was a 1,400 square feet apartment, and they were renting it for just about $1,000. And so I decided to build a house inside of a house. Here you can see a mattress. So I used to live there. But the moment that we took the same diagram to Los Angeles, this is a retail store that we did, it became white. And so this super elaborate thinking about what white means in a city like Los Angeles was something that I felt like an exercise that I had to do after seeing this. And the idea of white as a canvas, or whether or not color is still relevant, is something that we don't want to forget as a practice, because we do like rainbows and we love unicorns. And we also love the mixing of cool and warm colors, the way that Barbara Kasten might do it. And so the idea of projection, or projecting color onto something that's white, is something else that I think we're working through. So that's part 2, materiality. And so part 3, fitness. During the 2015 Shenzhen Biennial, we were asked by the curator, Aaron Betsky, to do 2 things. Number 1, can you do a 3D collage? And number 2, can you be contextual? So at the Shenzhen Biennial, I guess we were feeling a sense of discomfort with the concept of contextualism. So what we decided to do was we went on a shopping spree, and we constructed a 12-point guide for how to shop. And we specifically looked for goods that were made in China and possibly having passed through Shenzhen and exported to the United States. And we wanted to ask these objects a very important question. Dear object, are you homesick? Can we bring you on a trip back to Shenzhen for a class reunion? Which is exactly what we did. We exported back these imported objects for them to be on display for the consumerism that we live in now, and then we exported back again for them to return to the United States. So these boxes and these objects were mailed back and forth between the United States and China for at least, so they crossed the Pacific Ocean at least 4 times. And clearly we were thinking about a lot of visual references, including Archie Zoom, including Stanley Kubrick, but unlike Stanley Kubrick, who can afford expensive French furniture, we can only go to the dollar store. And here you can see a kind of fitness situation where the shapes of the objects are, of course, not well fitting to each other, but then they're so far apart that we created these large gaps. So we considered that almost a kind of urbanism the moment that we placed the scale figures in there. So this kind of loose-fitting scenario is one kind of fitness, a loose-fitting scenario. But then when we did the Coachella Music Festival at the Tower of 12 Story, it was not a loose-fitting situation. It became an ill-fitting situation where the shapes not only did not fit each other, but they created these gaping holes. And luckily we had a structural engineer who was very willing to listen. Here you can see that it was really important to us that of the 12 columns that are supporting the structure, 0 out of the 12 columns were perpendicular to the ground, which is stupid. And this cylinder right here, at this point, a point of tangent behaving in compression should be facing upward rather than downward, because that's actually very inefficient and also very stupid. But luckily, he was willing to listen, and we came up with a few great structural solutions. So, for instance, instead of thinking of the 12 columns as columns, we thought of them as 4 tripods. And the 4 tripods were, actually super strong, particularly when you fit them back together. So this is 2 out of the 4 tripods that were, fitted back together. And as far as the tangent point, we thought of this extra large point weld concept that allowed the bubbles to be tied together, even at the points of tangents. So if we went from a loose fitting to an ill fitting, we then begin to wonder, but that's not all we ever do, because we also at times work on a perfect fit, a well-fitting project. This is a retail store that we did in Los Angeles for a brand called Frankie. And this is our first brick and mortar retail project. And for us, we were thinking, what if we embedded all of the required retail program into a staircase and allow the staircase to come apart? Because when the staircase is back together, we make this bleacher object that performs a social function. We can allow the clients to have events if they wanted to, which they never did. But even for the, as we were thinking back, even for the 2013 Storefront for Art and Architecture 99 Chairs project, we also were working with this kind of 3D jigsaw puzzle that allowed pieces to be put back together. And here we use color to index the location of things, a giant rainbow sweeping through it, so that we know how to put the rainbow back together from a series of broken clouds. So Polly Eiffelbaum, I think, as a person she's an artist, this project, not in any way, shape, or form, is really such an important source of inspiration for us in thinking about the loose-fitting nature of fitness. And it allowed us to be thinking, so this is our Taiwan Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. It allowed us to be thinking, if we do like cartoons, and if cartoon is almost an episodic designation of program in plan, couldn't we imagine that the boundary of the page is the boundary of the architecture that the bubbles are in? And if the said cartoon page has a distinct, speech acts, then maybe we can easily find cartoons almost everywhere in architecture in a loose-fitting way. So the question of fitness, the well-fitting, ill-fitting, and the loose-fitting, possibly even as they merge into each other, which I think I had a super nice conversation today with Margaret about this, and you guys are super lucky to have him. The question of fitness is all that's on my mind at the moment. How do things merge? When they merge, do they become one thing? Is there a hierarchy between them? Do they change into a third condition, and so forth? Because to me, this is not just an architectural problem; it's a mathematical problem. Okay, so this is part 4, meta-modernism. I don't know. Should I talk about this? It's kind of boring. So treatise is okay. As I was saying, here, let me just fast forward to this. So we had the opportunity to put together an exhibition, symposium, and a publication series all in one go at the Grant Foundation. If you don't know what the Grant Foundation is, I would really encourage you to find them. So if you're seeking a life of research and experimentation, the Grant Foundation is your ally. They are there to give you money to work on projects that you want to work on that are for the purposes of advancing art and architecture through means of research, experimentation, and possibly exhibition. And there are different categories of this. I really highly recommend you to have a closer look at the Grant Foundation. So we felt super lucky to be able to do this. And Andrew Kovacs is on the wall here, and actually in the model. So the symposium itself was also, how do you say this, a gas? I invited Darius to be a part of this project. I just realized that Darius was here, Darius Carcassoni. I think he goes by a different name here. I invited Darius, but Darius was too busy being in Tennessee. And this is Sarah Herda. Sarah Herda is, again, another super important person to know. She is the director of the Grant Foundation. So, of course, doing a symposium like this, we had the Charlottesville tapes in mind. Charlottesville's tape was an event that happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, where a group of architects, being possibly out of work or too egocentric or all of it, or teaching too hard, decided that they needed to be locking themselves up in the same room for extended 2 or 3 days and engage in super intense conversations. So here you can sort of make out a younger Frank Gehry, a Rem Koolhaas with hair, a super polite looking Toyo Ito. They managed to get all these people together in one room, and these arguments at times were super heated, and they were entirely transcribed. For example, Leon Krier ironically clapping that many times, and it was transcribed. And here's Stanley Tigerman standing in the middle. That's a young, look at that, that's Arata Isosaki, looking super young. And I think he's looking at her. So, of course, doing a project like this in this day and age, we were also thinking about our contemporaries. Who are the people doing publication today, and how are they different from a different time? And so I really felt that the publication culture recently is a culture of compilations. In other words, it's a culture of mixtapes, not albums. Because there was a time when people did a lot of albums. So Stephen Hull, when he was younger, he, along with all his friends, got together and made these super beautiful pamphlets, pamphlet architecture series, where each and every one of the pamphlets focused on topics that they, devoted to, and there was a deep dive on every topic. And I really appreciated that. I, subsequently made my own assessment. This was the grant proposal that I wrote, one of the pages of the grant proposals that I wrote. I made this really snarky assessment of the first 34 pamphlets, and realized that pamphlet architecture may have been a game for people under 45, because I think once Stephen Hull became too successful in his practice, he couldn't really do this anymore. Because when Stephen Hull started this project, Pamphlet Architecture, he was really fresh-faced and didn't have a job. And what can you do when you don't really have a job? I guess you publish. I wish somebody told me this when I was younger. Architecture as a professional practice is super harmful for people with baby faces. Or if you're just straight up young. I think it's super harmful because it's a game of trust. I wish somebody told me that architecture is almost always a game of millions of dollars. Even when it's not anywhere close to $1 million as for the total budget, it's still insurance liability of a game of millions. So if you had money and you want to invest in a property, and if you want to turn something around, and you approach someone to design something for you, it takes a lot to trust a fresh face, I guess. So from the investor's point of view, I guess I can understand that. But it's tough for people who have energy and want to spend them. And now looking at the generation of pamphlet architecture, I suppose I can understand that they probably couldn't spend their energy either because their faces were too fresh and they couldn't get anything done. And at that point, perhaps all one could do is research and experiment. So this was the project, and by behaving as sort of an editor, I think I was able to understand my cohorts a bit better. So for example, Peter Jan Henkel's, the Belgian architect slash artist, I finally realized why I was always so drawn to him is the same reason why I've always been drawn to Hieronymus Bosch, or maybe the way I look at fake industries and Bernard Schumi, or Andrew Kovacs and Oldenburg. I mean, I can go on. And I also even started thinking about people I should have included or could have included and how they may relate to other projects. So if you're looking at Peter Paul Rubens and at the same time thinking about digital computational surfaces, maybe the doubly curved surface of the fat on fat of the baby, at times the baby cheeks and the baby butts, would create these kinds of cusps geometrically. And maybe that's why they're thinking about a kind of fabrication this way. Or maybe if history was material, and so on and so forth. And I even began to consider that maybe there's an entire category of people that I had omitted. If they're not looking at paintings or history or music, they're really just looking at architecture, and architecture itself is the medium. Maybe there are younger people who are doing that, including Léon Léon or KGDVS or Soil. But anyway, this was the class photo, and I also couldn't have really done this without the existence of possible mediums from Adam Fury, Kyle Miller, Christy Balliet, and Kelly Baer, where they first got together and started a project like this. So an underlying similarity between all these people, today I really had a very nice conversation with a student from here, whose thesis project is about irony. And I start, it's something that's really been on my mind. Why do all of my cohorts look and sound so ironic, yet they have no ounce of true cynicism in them? And how is it that we were educated the way that we were educated, having had professors who were deep in the trenches of postmodernism? And this type of relationship has been on my mind for some time now. And luckily, there are these Dutch philosophers who are working through it. I think I could sort of show this already. There's really no point to talk about normcore. Normcore is and I identified 4 outcomes of, or kind of reaction to postmodernism of sorts. Maybe one is people who resisted by being as normal as possible, a kind of Seinfeld sensibility. And maybe there's a kind of exaggeration of the postmodern tendencies by doing even more and having more excessive projects, as many as possible. Well, see, this is the part where I feel like I just need to be skipping slides because it's really not that interesting. The lecture is too long anyway. But for us, I guess, for us, I really feel like, okay, maybe I can embrace that. Maybe I can embrace the fact that I was raised on pop culture that was very ironic. I was raised on a pop culture, when I was young enough, there was Simpsons and Seinfeld, and then later in college, there was stuff like South Park. And I think, if you felt that something was possibly suspicious or if you have a sense of skepticism about something, I guess from television, the only way to articulate that is through a sense of ironic sounding statements. And it is as though we inherited a cultural reflex, a sneeze, if you will, that just simply sounds ironic, whatever it is that we say, whether or not we mean it. And I find that to be okay. I think we're just going to do that because we're just going to consume and embrace both high culture and pop culture. I grew up on, these are the things that I grew up on. The Bubble Dragon stuff, which I don't know if anybody knew. If you put that with Noguchi, into a blender. Or Canadian art slash Korean propaganda. And maybe, does anyone know this? Yes, Kung Fury. do you know what I mean? What if I don't have to make a choice between high culture and pop culture, and what if that is just a part of who we are as a generation? Okay, so this is the last portion. I feel like I'm able to power through it with relative ease. I only had to skip not too many things. So we do a lot of temporary installations, and with that comes the plight of putting stuff away. So this obviously didn't work. We tried to sell it. I mean, it's so sad. No one even wanted it, like for $150. But we got to reuse it. So the saddest part about all of this is, after Coachella was finished, we had to, about 70% of it went into the dumpsters. And, not that, I don't know, like, of course everybody should care about environmentalism. And, as we're doing this, I just felt this deep sense of guilt that I had to become vegan for a month. We were just throwing stuff away, we were just destroying the environment. It was so terrible doing these kinds of temporary experiments. And so when the time came that MoMA PS1 approached, we became finalists for the MoMA PS1 project, we thought, okay, let's do that again. Let's do these cartoonish bubbles, like the way that we did the Coachella project, but let's not build them. Let's just find them. And we realized that they were really already everywhere. And in fact, we called a bunch of companies, and they were more than willing to let us borrow them and return it intact. And so we thought, okay, let's just go through their catalog of shapes and use the bubble shapes that they have already. Because these bubble shapes, are in Hayduk's plans. And these bubble shapes are in Yona Friedman's drawings. Let's just take a bunch of pools and hang them and make the spatial city a reality. That was really our first thought process. So I think I will be able to end my lecture. Here's where I was trying to explain to the committee members of MoMA that you don't even have to be human to appreciate being in the pool together. It's a place of, coming of age, falling in love, getting in trouble, falling in love, or coming of age. And if we were to consider our Coachella project, a bunch of pools flipped 90 degrees, surely we can imagine actual pools being rotated in its correct orientation. And, wouldn't it be just fun to see a bunch of bellies of pools? So I will play this video, and then that's it.
Summertime is a time of leisure. It is a time when we remember to forget, at least for 1 or 2 weekends, there should not be a single worry in the world. Any hard-working person should take some time off, partake in some casual day drinking, half listen to some outdoor concerts, and forget your worldly sadness. Welcome to Pool Party, where no athletic abilities are required, and our only desire is a safe haven for a poolside lazy summer afternoon. Pool Party is an archipelago of half-forgotten dreams, like the clouds that fly over our heads whilst we all dance together in and around the shape of the shadows they cast. Strap on, relax, and enjoy the pool party. Pool Party is virtually indestructible. Engineer Matthew Melnick from NAS Engineering helped us develop a structural system where we can create a lightweight framework safe for 5,000 drunk people. Pool Party creates a pleasant climatic environment with a network of cooling factors including shaped shadows that stencils the sun, as well as design evaporative systems. Pool Party creates a striking visual environment where visitors can dance under a sky of upside-down bellies of pools. Pool Party will be relatively easy to build. There are only very few basic material components to manage: tools, water collection system, structural framework, and on-the-ground furniture pieces. First, there are 9 pools. We consider each pool to be characters with personalities. We have always liked pools at Bureau Spectacular. Our Coachella project Tower of 12 Stories was a collection of pools stacked vertically. But what if we won't have to spend extra material or waste more energy to construct the pools, but follow the tradition of Marcel Duchamp and find a flying fleet of oversized fountains? What if we can find some off-market, already defective pools that companies would have disposed but gather them together into a team of misfit heroes in an epic rescue mission? For instance, Dune Bug, Lil Bob, Lazy L, True L, or the Ottawa are all industry standard pools we already identified. No new energy will be required to construct the pools, and no pools will go into the dumpsters afterwards. We have had our share of heartbreaks with throwing away art projects we love. The next component is the water collection system. We will acquire a small amount of irrigation pipes and connect it into a network that pulls, drains, and nozzles out water. We have been calculating the correct sun angle between 12 to 4 p.m. in this geographic region of the world and hope to spray rainbows against our pools. The third important component is the structural grid. Our initial question was, what if there is a construction happening in or around New York, set October 2017? Our idea is to schedule the install in a synchronized motion with a project partner so that another group of people can reuse our structure almost immediately after. The last component is the collection of furniture-like objects on the ground. There will be a shallow pool-like object drained daily where people can sit around and chit-chat. This is a story about reuse, reduce and recycle. We want to construct a system where a reduced amount of energy will be required to build the shapes we would have wanted to build anyway, and no amount of curated material will go to waste. This is also a story about the culture in or around pools. A drought in the 20th century became the very foundation of skateboarding as a sport in California when a creative use the dry pool took place in Dogtown. One could perhaps argue that this event became the first human physical interaction with an elliptic paraboloid. In a non-athletic sense, the culture of the pool is also a romantic space for the puppy love rescue scene in The Sandlot, the jealous passive-aggressive horseplays in Mrs. Doubtfire, the outlandish extravaganzas in The Anchorman, the sense of infinite sadness in Less Than Zero, the full-blown eroticism in Wild Things, Showgirl, or Alpha Dog, or the flirtatious cocktail winks in any Bond movies. The blue glowing pool has been a prime setting for iconic moments of fantasy space, getting in trouble, falling in love, or coming of age. Visitors do not need to know or care about our love for Cedric Price, Kishore Kurokawa, John Hader, or Yona Friedman. Pool party casting a group of shadows that shield tired and overworked people from the hot summer sun. Sitting on a 60 by 60 feet banding box and peaking at 30 feet in height, Pool Party is a very feasible canopy system visible far away from PS1. For 18 years, the Young Architects program at MoMA PS1 has continuously been one of the most important platforms for architectural experimentation. Similar to the examination of an ice core sample, PS1 is a marker of air quality for every annual increment over the last 2 decades. Every single submission of the competition, built or unbuilt, is an evidence that documents the spirit of the times for every season. For that, we want to begin by saying, thank you, MoMA PS1, for offering all of us a reason to reach higher.
Working harder, make it better, moving faster, makes us stronger, more than ever, hour after hour, work is never over. Working harder, make it better, moving faster, makes us stronger, more than ever, hour after.
You'll have some questions?
Sure, yeah.
Questions? Or comments?
Yeah, it could be, and I think we're also discovering that it's really sunny all the time, and as an environmental response, white is actually really good at reflecting sunlight. No, but people just paint everything. I've been thinking about this a lot too. Like for some practices, they really want to highlight the materiality, and so the materiality itself becomes a key communicator. But for people who use color, I'm just thinking, it's almost a political declaration. If I think of the color, yellow and red, I may be thinking about Spain or China, or Vietnam. Or if I think about red, white, blue, it's either here or Netherlands or France, Russia. I think maybe color has a different kind of communicative function in Los Angeles, and to be as anonymous as possible in LA. As you said, maybe since everything's loud, how does one declare itself mute? It seems like white is a solution, and I don't know. This is just my observation.
I guess a comment and a question. You seem like you're having a lot of fun with the practice in general, and that's amazing to see because I think sometimes we get a little stuffy sometimes, and that's revitalizing, I guess. But my question is, you seem to take a lot of inspiration from LA itself, and could you operate in another city the same kind of way that you do it in LA?
Well, I think I'll engage both comments from the standpoint of economics. I think at one point in life I realized that, I think it was something I was mentioning earlier to the thesis group as well. At one point in time I realized that the only labor I will perform is a labor of joy. If I have to do anything that's a labor of sustenance, I'm enslaving myself, and I don't want to do that. And if I'm aware of that, why would I do that? And so I'll find ways to do work that I'll find fulfillment and sense of purpose in. And if there's no sense of purpose, I won't do it. So that's, I think, the first answer to your first point. The other is also economics. Just also comes back to the fresh face comment earlier. I lived in Chicago for 6 years. People in Chicago are very, let's say, careful with their money. And but people in Los Angeles are not. And I'm finding that, who would spend that much money on a temporary structure in Coachella? That's so ridiculous. And irresponsible. So we couldn't do it anywhere else right now, I don't think. But maybe later on I can start behaving more mature, and maybe I can make it somewhere else. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Maybe I want to say thank you very much for your lecture. We really enjoyed that. I wanted to ask, you seem to have, when you're presenting, there's almost an equal weight assigned to all these different references that you're showing. And I don't know if this is so much a question, or maybe I was just asking for your comments, but there's kind of an equal weight to the Sandlot and Seinfeld and the ancient Greek sculpture. And I'm really wondering what your reaction to this collapse of high art and low art.
Incidentally, Pompeii was destroyed by a volcano, and it could have been anywhere. And people doing their daily nonsense would have been discovered doing their daily nonsense. And in our lifetime, it's just going to be really embarrassing in our lifetime when they dig up the landfills for archaeological purposes. And so given a long enough time period, I think everything is culture, and everything will be cultural, and maybe everything already is cultural. And I want, at least maybe that's one way of answering your question. I find the academic influences very important, and of course I revere it. But it doesn't mean that I don't live in my time, and I think it's important for me to think about what Seinfeld has done to us.
So you called architecture a game of trust, and it's a lot harder for young people to gain that trust. So like, how, as young people, do we get trust so that we get to do something?
Fun, trust, fun.
Trust, not trust fund.
Trust fund. No, I mean it's really hard. And I say this jokingly, but also not in some ways. So I don't know. The picture has gotten bleaker every year, and I think this is a greater conversation at large. You know, I'm from the middle class, and I had to do a lot of work to continue to demonstrate that I'm doing more and more and more, and I've never been paid a cent by my own company. I've paid other people only, and you know, I've busted my butt to keep the company alive by doing, you know, miscellaneous things. And I think this question of the like how do you sustain yourself? I mean, like apply for grants or you know, be entrepreneurial. I don't know. I think it's gotten worse every year because at the beginning of the time that I started teaching, which is roughly 10 years ago, American students' relationship with debt was a bit different from their relationship with debt now. I remember, you know, there was a time that I guess if you have experienced the sensation of what the best and the brightest might be in the field of architecture, there were a few ways of achieving that or you know, advancing that feeling. And at that time, you know, like going to work for OMA was one of the ways of training yourself, or perhaps starting your own practice is one of the ways of doing it. But the ones that the quote unquote best and the brightest that I'm seeing today, they have to go to Gensler. They don't have a choice. Their relationship with debt really prevents them from doing anything, and I think that's a bigger problem. Not one that, you know, immediate design solutions can resolve. And I find that to be personally find that to be really bleak. You know, I'm Canadian, so my relationship with debt is very different from American people. And perhaps Darius Karaksoni can go to Athens and hang out because he's European. You know, he also has a different relationship with debt. And so I think it's hard. I think it's really hard. And so, the people who get to do these kinds of things are Canadians, Europeans, and people with trust fund, it seems. But maybe not. Maybe there are ways of, I don't know, like it's only been 10 years that I've been doing this, and so it's both a sprint and a marathon. The sprint and the marathon required me to live very cheaply for a very long time. You know, like I said, I've been priced out of Skid Row.
Do you think, just to build on that and try to put, you know, kind of get a little bit more out of you on this topic, because I think it's really a good one.
Mhm.
Do you think that the refusal to work as labor in favor of work as joy can be linked up with gaining trust as a young person?
Hopefully.
Because that seemed really powerful to me, that you would have that sensibility.
Right.
Which doesn't mean you don't work, it means that you work in a certain manner, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah, true. Now I want to say something encouraging, which is if you display a labor of joy, your sensibility is going to infect those around you. And there are other forms of economy, I think, and you know, I want to say that one can make it these days still. And I think the infectious nature of this kind of like labor of joy, I think generates a different feeling, and I think, you know, if you apply feelings to supply and demand, there is an economic diagram in there probably. Yes?
Thanks, Jimenez, for a great show of the work. That was really cool. This is going to be a little bit of I think it's a risky question,
That's fine. Yeah, go for it.
but I find it really easy to root for your work because it's just fun and interesting and thoughtful, and
I get that. The work that we do looks, I don't know, kind of stupid. It looks, I know, I totally get that. And it's not a problem to ask that because it does look stupid and we want it to be a little stupid. At the same time, I mean, so how do I feel about the other people also wanting to do stupid things? I don't really know. It's their, I mean, I guess they're taking their, what, sorry.
I didn't mean to cut you off, but I don't mean to like, I want to impugn your work at all. It's fascinating, brilliant, amazing work. And I love mainly I love what you have to say about your work and its capacity to enact certain things in the world or to participate with a culture that's ready to interact with
Right.
it that I really love. But I think that's, like, I don't know, I see a cultural or a stylistic culture within architecture now that's, I feel like there's a two-headed or a multi-headed monster, let's say, but two really prominent ones are a kind of simple geometry, a colorful tone, et cetera, and another one we might describe as like a madly articulated, serious tones, a lot of lines on the page, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder, like, if you think about that and what you talked about with friends about such things, for instance.
I don't really have friends. I don't know. I want to talk about it, but you know, it's really hard. I want to talk about it with friends, but people get really, I don't know. People hold their cards closer to their chest every time these kinds of conversations come up. So only in like really serious academic contexts can we converse about it. But even then, I don't know. Like people get upset with each other, and I don't know. There's not a lot of conversations.
You're in a safe space here, though.
What do I think about my colleagues' work? Some of them I really, really enjoy, and I think, like Andrew Kovacs, for instance, he's one of my favorites. And I think the way he talks about found objects, and the idea of found objects at large is really smart and super interesting. And I think we definitely have moments of overlaps there. And when I think about how his work could be compared to Mark Gage, strangely, I'm also a fan. And I find that there's a interesting overlap between the two of them. But I don't know, there are practices out there that I don't know, I just have a harder time getting into. I don't know if this is probably very dissatisfying as an answer.
Well, you and I talked privately earlier about the influence you're having, at such a young age, as it were, like kind of defying some of the very things that you said about, how young, fresh faces can gain trust, and you're an example of a young, fresh face, not as young and fresh as before, but still young and fresh, who has kind of gained trust. I mean, as evidenced by the work, of course, but also evidenced by, a kind of genre of people who've been influenced by, by the things that you've done. So that's, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and it's a tough question. So maybe we can give him just a softball, easy one to end on, if someone has something in mind. There we go. Good stuff.
Does the type of work that you're doing is more playful, more joyful? Does that seem to lend itself more to more transparency with the public versus an architect that's doing your normal everyday type of commercial housing where you can just kind of peek behind the curtain?
I hope we can I hope we can revisit this conversation 10 years from now, because I want to do the normal everyday projects. It's just that the road getting there has been a bit more meandering than I like. In 2008, I wrote this was right before the financial crisis, and this is how one of the trajectories that could have happened to my career. In 2008, I wrote a business letter to a developer, explaining to the developer that they need new typologies to their cookie cutter homes. And they responded saying, I don't know what you do, but can you do something with this amount of money? And so we started working on it, and then the crash came, and that got canceled. But meaning somebody was responsive to someone with no track record at the time. And so, and also it means that we had every intention to start a normal practicing career, except the financial crisis hit, and we had to do all this nonsense. But hopefully, we can, as you saw there, we can translate some of the energy that's spent into rethinking the diagram of a retail store, which we're doing, in rethinking what a house is, or housing projects are. We're rethinking what museums can be, now that we've had a lot of time to really develop our thought processes. Such a conversation kind of, I had a really hard conversation with a friend, and now I can fully consider him a friend. So I do have friends. There's this one guy. I can fully consider this person a friend after that conversation. Florian Eidenberg from Soil. He once, this was at the 2015 Chicago Biennial, meaning just about 2 years and change ago, 2 years and a few months ago. And in 2015, we were chatting, and everyone was a little drunk, and he just said to me, okay, let me talk to you about Microsoft or Johnson & Johnson. These kinds of companies, if they spend about 5% of their total revenue towards research and experimentation, meaning money they're going to throw away, that's really generous. We, at SoIl, Florian Eidenberg and Jing Liu, spend about 20% of our total cash flow. We're going to throw it away because I think it's important for our cultural presence, for our research and development. But you, Jimenez Lai, you spent 100% on R&D. How long do you think you can live like this? And that was year 8 of doing this. And that's year 1 of wanting a normal practice. I want a normal practice, but which is not to say that I don't want to do nonsense. I want to do both, but hopefully the nonsense can make the normal stuff a bit more nonsensical. Yeah. Thank you.